This lesson is set to give you a few examples of callbacks, how you can create promises in JavaScript, and then how you can use the async and await in order to, when you resolve promises or you can reject promises, and then how you can move to the next step, so even chaining various resolved callbacks together and then making use of the results once the results and the promises get resolved or rejected. And we're also going to be connecting to a JSON file. And this JSON file, we're going to take the data from the JSON file, and once the promise of fetch is completed, once the data comes back from the JSON file, then we're going to make use of it and output it into our web page. So that's coming up in this lesson. And it's designed to give you a quick overview with some simple examples of callbacks and how promises work in JavaScript. I've created an HTML file linking to a JavaScript file called app5.js, and we just have the one element on the page, and that's got a class of output. So let's select the JavaScript and connect to that page element so we can output some content within that output element. So using the document query selector, we're going to select that element from the page, and this way we can access it and interact with it very easily within our JavaScript code just by referencing that variable. And I'm just double checking to make sure that I did have access to the variable. So we are going to be looking at concurrency, and essentially what concurrency is that it allows things to happen essentially at the same time or in parallel. Concurrency does have callback, is that a callback essentially a function that's taking a function as an argument and calls the function back when it's done with the rest of the function. So let's give a quick example of a callback and create a function. And this function is the one that's going to get the callback function that's passed into it. And then it's going to execute the callback function within this main function, set as one of the arguments. So essentially this is going to be the callback, and then invoke the callback function code. So we want to actually invoke that function. I'll just call it starter, and we're not going to need to pass in any arguments. And then within this function, it's going to output into the console hello world. Now let's execute the main function with the callback of the starter function. So ultimately what's going to happen is we're going to be invoking the main function and adding the starter function as the parameter, which is going to be picked up as the argument within the main function. And then it's going to be using that, the callback value, and invoking it with the rounded brackets. So let's see what happens. So when we save the code, we actually execute the content contained within starter and see the output within the console. So that's a very simple example of a callback. Let's do a second example, and this is going to be that we're going to be sending a greeting. So we'll have a few more parameters that we're going to be using within the callback function. So we want to create one and call this the greeting, and this is going to take in a value for the full name. And then we're going to use that full name, and this is actually going to be an array that we're going to use as the full name. And we can console log the response value back. And here, let's set a variable called val, and using the template literals, so the backticks that are to the left of the one key on most keyboards, let's write a quick welcome message and a quick greeting that's going to be output to the user. So selecting that value, and with the full name array, we're going to select the first item within that array, and then also select the second item within that same array using the index values, and output that into the console. And now we want to set a way to process the call. So this function is going to be the one that is going to take in the value of the user, and then it's going to also have the callback function that we want to output, where we're going to be outputting the greeting content. And I'll just call this one pro1. So it's going to take in a couple parameters here, and one is going to be user, and the second one is going to be the callback function that we want to invoke. So let's take the value from the user, and we'll construct an array. So taking the user and split those values by space, and I'll just update this to be the single quotes. So that way we can pass in a string value with the user's first name and last name and convert it into an array that's going to be set within the full name value. And then invoke the callback function, and we want to pass in an argument into the callback function, and that's going to be the result of the full name. And within the callback function, we do have that argument full name, which is going to be output into the content. So once we've set it up, we're ready to call to it. So let's create a string value, first and last name. And then the callback function is going to be greeting. And we get that output into the console. And then now you can use any name, and it's going to send out a customized greeting to whatever the name is that you've added in. So next up, let's look at some promises. A promise object represents the eventual completion or asynchronous operation, so it can be their completion or failure of an asynchronous operation resulting in a value. So a simple example of it, and just do that down here near the bottom, where we'll set up our promise and creating a new promise object. And you can assign any variable name to it. So I'm just using promise in this example. And there's two properties here that either it will resolve or it will reject the promise. And this is going to be a function using the arrow format. And so if we do resolve the promise, we can have a value of ready. And using then, so once the promise is resolved, then it's going to execute a function, and that's where we use the keyword then. So we're going to take whatever the value is and return that within the console. So let's output val into the console. And if it's not able to complete the promise, if we end up rejecting the promise, we can use the keyword catch to catch any issues. And for that as well, we could capture the value and output that value into the console. So let's see what happens, and we do get ready. And with promises, you can chain multiple functions and results, resolved results. If we want to have another output in the next step along the way, let's see how that works. And we get a result of undefined being output. I'm going to actually comment out some of these values so that we only have the promises right now within the console. And the reason that we're getting undefined is that when you are chaining promises together, you have to do a return of whatever the value is that you want to output. So if we return back a value of, and that actually should be in the previous step. So if we return a value of hello, that's going to get picked up as the value in the next part of the chain. And if we want to output world, we can add in the next result and the next promise in the chain. And if we don't have any additional promises that are going to get resolved in the chain, then we can just output that as a value. So in this case, we come into the promise, and once the promise has been resolved, we pass over a value of ready, and that gets picked up whenever we're running then, which is the next input. So whenever that result is resolved, then the input next value is what we can use. So that's where we're getting ready, and then we're returning hello, and the next step we're returning world, and then lastly, that's where it's outputting world. And the catch can just remain on its own so that if we do throw any errors along the way, then the catch can catch those errors. Let's create a second promise. And in this case, instead of resolve, what we're going to do is reject. So we'll have a reject, and we'll type error here, give this a different value. So we can call that promise 1, and the second one can be promise 2. And so what happened in this case is that we rejected the result of the promise, and we threw this message, which is error here, and that got caught with the catch and output that result value into the console. So because the promise was rejected instead of being resolved, that's where we are able to throw the reject. And when you are creating an async process, you will need to wait for the result to be resolved. And if there are any errors, then you can catch any issues and deal with those errors as it comes up rejected. So using the keyword async before a function makes the function return a promise. So I'll give you an example of that. So when we are using async and we create a function, and I'll create the function test1, the value that we're going to be returning here is going to be the word hello, or the string value of hello. So now if we want to use the test1 function, we can invoke test1 using then, which is going to create and use it as a promise. And the same that we had over here where we had the resolve reject functions that are used as callbacks. And let's save that. And we need to define these functions that are for the resolve or for the reject. So we can actually create anonymous functions that can handle the resolve and the reject. So the first one is going to be a resolve. And here we can use the value and do something with the value. So if the code is successful, then it's going to run that first part. And we can output within the console log our result for val1. And here we can have a value for val2. And correspondingly, if it does get rejected, then we can output the value of val2. And I just got to fix the rounded brackets there. And let's send in within that as the result of hello world. I'm going to also comment out the other console log values that we had used previously so that we only get the one async value that's going to contain hello world. So it was resolved successfully, and that's where we're able to output into the console. So you can also add into the console whether it was resolved or rejected, as right now they're both going to be outputting whatever value is passed through. And we see that it did get resolved, and that means that the callback was successful and we're able to output that value into the console. So if you are not expecting an error, you can simplify this async statement, and we'll do an async for test2. I'll just give it a value of hello world 2. And we can simplify the result here as we're only expecting a resolution of the value that it's going to actually resolve. And therefore, we can simply skip to just the resolve because we are expecting a normal value. So we're not expecting to throw an error, and that way we can return back just the console value. And in addition, you can also chain together additional then, just as we did before, and having a callback of the value. And let's just fix that. And we can rename this to data so it's different. And right now we're getting undefined. So if we wanted to return back a value, that way we can pick it up in the next step along the promise chain where we're returning it as then. And that's where it's outputting the value of wow. And because we did select the output element, we can update the text content of it to whatever we've got the result of data. So whenever all of these promises are completed, that's where we're going to see the value of wow being output into that output element. Let's do one more example where we're going to add in a timeout. So that will add in some time between when the promises are completed, either whether they're resolved or rejected. So the callbacks on those promises. So this, again, can be greet. And the greeting can be whatever the message is that's passed in. And for the function, we want to do a return, and we're going to be returning back a promise. And if the promise is resolved, let's set a timeout. And within the timeout values, this is where we're going to complete the resolve. So just as we did before, we were working with the promises. When we resolve, we can pass through a value, And in this case, we're going to be passing through resolve and a value of whatever the value is. So selecting resolve and then message, and add to that message. And I'm going to use the backticks, so the template literals for this, and include within the expression the message value. So this will complete every second, 1000 milliseconds. It will move on to the next part. So set up async and then a function which will be the greet, and we'll just call it greet3, as this is going to be outputting the greetings. So within the console, and we're going to be returning back this value as a callback. So within the console log, let's output whatever data is returned back. And then for setting the variable using await, we're going to set the response to the greet2 function, and then pass in whatever we've got the value for the message. So basically we're going to take that message into greet3 and then pass it in to greet2, setting this up as a promise. So let's do greet3 and just put a name there. And we can launch it several times. And I do need to update that callback function to match with the promise for resolve. And this actually should be val. So once we correct that, we can see that we're getting the promises passed in. And once it's able to resolve the promises on the 1 second timeout, we're seeing that we're outputting the value of message for Laurence, message for Svekis, and then message for John. So whatever values we're passing in there. And then you can also slow the timeout. So let's put it to 4 seconds. So now we count to 4 seconds. And then all of these are being set up in the background. And once the timeout is ready, it sends the resolve callback. And that resolve callback then outputs that message value into the console. So it constructs the message value using the await, where it waits for the promise to resolve, and then finally, lastly, outputs the value. So now let's use the async and await function in order to connect to a JSON file. So creating a brand new file. So this is sitting on the same directory as our apps5.js. And this is going to be a JSON file, so let's save it as such. Well, we'll just have a series of values for first and last names. And that way we can loop through the array of objects and pick that information up within the JavaScript code. So that's going to be the first object. And then just comma separate that object. And how about we just do 3 quick ones. And then this one can be John. And let's just do a quick change of the last name. So that gives us a quick JSON file to work with. And now let's select that JSON file using the async. So we need to set up the source URL. And the source URL is going to be the data.json file. So sitting on the same directory as the JavaScript code. And let's return back the JSON data. This can be the variable where we capture the response back from the JSON file. So using async to set up our function, just as what we did up here, where we set up the async function. And this can just be an anonymous function. And then within here, we can set to try. So let's select and create a variable called data and set up the await, where we can fetch to the URL. And once that is completed, we can then get the resolved value back from the await, and that's going to be coming from the data JSON object. And let's console log the resolved value. And if there are any issues, we can use try and catch. And here we can console log any of the errors that might be thrown, and catching the errors as an error value. So let's make a connection and invoke the JSON data. So it's going to return back all of the results from the JSON file. And this one is actually going to be completed afterwards because we have that timeout of 4 seconds. So that's why it actually got completed afterwards, even though that we had initiated this promise before we made the connection to the JSON data. And as we're outputting the data, then we can interact with it and we can update it. So let's do that as well, where we want to, once we get the content in, we'll just add it to page. So once it's ready, we've got an object and an array that we're passing to a function, add to page. So this is going to be essentially an array of objects, and we're going to loop through the array using for each and pick up each one of the items within the array. And for now, what we'll do is we'll just console log it out as each element. And so this way we are set to take the output inner HTML. So we'll just add to the inner HTML. So let's set up a div, and using the element first value and then the element last value, and output that onto the page. So once it's ready and it's connected to the JSON data, we're ready to use it and output it into our HTML page. So it's essentially making a request in the back, running using promises and as well fetch to make that request. And then once that promise is completed, then we can pass along and get the data